Hey, um, gonna read a chapter that from Emanuel Swedenborgs Divine Providence, um, his book Divine Providence. On um, the chapter title is "It is a law of divine providence that man shall not be compelled by external means to think and will, thus to believe and love what pertains to religion, but bring himself and at times compel himself to do so." So this is like obviously it's all important, but this helped me heaps. Um, this particular chapter, so I thought I'd read some of it and maybe comment or have a bit of a chat about stuff. So I'll read some out. This law of divine providence follows from the preceding two, namely, man is to act in freedom according to reason, and is to do this of himself and yet from the Lord, thus as of himself. Inasmuch as being compelled is not to act in freedom according to reason, and also not to act of oneself, but to act from what is not freedom and from someone else. This law of divine providence follows in due order on the first two. Everyone knows that no one can be forced to think what he is unwilling to think, or to will what he decides not to will, thus to believe what he does not believe, least of all what he wills not to believe, or to love what he does not love, and still less what he wills not to love. For the spirit or mind of man enjoys complete freedom in thinking, willing, believing, and loving. It does so by influx which is not coercive from the spiritual world, for the human spirit or mind is in that world, and not by influx from the natural world received only when the two agree. A man can be driven to say that he thinks and wills, believes and loves what is religious, but if this is not a matter of his affection and reasoning, or does not become so, he does not think, will, believe, or love it. A man may also be compelled to speak in favour of religion, and to act according to it, but he cannot be compelled to think in its favour from any faith, or to will in its favour out of love for it. In countries in which justice and judgment are guarded, one is indeed compelled to speak, not to speak or act against religion, but still no one can be compelled to think and will in its favour, for everyone has freedom to think and to will along with, and in favour of, hell, or along with and in favour of heaven. Reason, however, teaches what either course is like and what lot awaits it, and by reason the will has the choice and decision. Plainly then, what is external cannot coerce what is internal. Nevertheless, it happens sometimes, but that it works harm will be shown in this order. 1. No one is reformed by miracles and signs, for they coerce. 2. No one is reformed by visions and communication with the dead, for they coerce. 3. No one is reformed by threats and penalties, as these coerce. 4. No one is reformed in states of no rationality or no freedom. 5. Self-compulsion is not contrary to rationality and freedom. And 6. The external man is to be reformed through the internal and not the other way about. 1. No one is reformed by miracles and signs, for they coerce. We have shown above that man has an internal and an external of thought, and that the Lord acts into the external by the internal in man, and so teaches and leads him. Also that it is of the Lord's divine providence that man is to act in freedom according to reason. Either action would perish in man if miracles were done and he were driven by them to believe. That this is so can be seen rationally in this way. Undeniably, miracles induce belief and powerfully persuade a person that what the miracle doer says and teaches is true, and at first this engages man's external of thought, virtually holding it spellbound. But one is deprived by this of the two faculties called rationality and liberty, thus cannot act in freedom according to reason, nor can the Lord then inflow into the external of man's thought through the internal, save only to leave man to confirm from his rationality what has been made a matter of his belief by the miracle. The state of man's thought is such that from the internal of thought he can see a piece in the external of his thought as in a mirror. For as was said above, one can behold one's own thought, which is possible only from more interior thought. Beholding the item as in a mirror, he can turn it this way and that, and shape it to look attractive to him. If there is truth in it, it may be likened to an attractive and animated maiden or youth. But if a man cannot turn it this way and that, and shape it, but only believe it, persuaded of it by a miracle, then there is no then if there is truth in it, it may be likened to a maiden or a youth carved in stone or wood, in which is nothing alive. It may also be compared to an object which is constantly in view, and looked at alone, one keeps one from seeing what is to either side and behind it. It can also be compared to a continual sound in the ear, which does away with perceiving the harmony of many sounds. Such are the blindness and deafness induced on the mind by miracles. It is the same with anything confirmed, but not regarded from rationality before it is confirmed. Plain it is from this that a faith induced by miracles is not faith, but persuasion, for it has nothing rational in it, still less anything spiritual, as it is only external without an internal. This is true of everything a man does from such persuasive faith, whether he is acknowledging God, worshipping him at home or in church, or doing good deeds. When only a miracle leads a person to acknowledgement of God and to adoration and piety, he acts from the natural and not from the spiritual man. For a miracle infuses belief by an external and not an internal way, thus from the world and not from heaven. The Lord enters man by an internal way, by the word and by doctrine and preaching from it. As miracles close this way, no miracles are done today. That miracles are of this nature can be clearly established from those performed in the presence of the people of Judah and Israel. Although they beheld many miracles in the land of Egypt, and later at the Red Sea, and others in the wilderness, and particularly on Mount Sinai, when the law was promulgated, nevertheless, in a month's time, while Moses tarried on that mountain, they made themselves a golden calf, and hailed it as Jehovah, who had led them out of the land of Egypt. Again, it is plain from the miracles done later in the land of Canaan. Nevertheless, the people fell away time and again from the prescribed worship. It is equally plain from the miracles which the Lord did before their eyes when he was in the world, yet they crucified him. I'm just going to skip forward to the next one. No one is reformed by visions or by communication with the dead, for they coerce. Visions are of two kinds, divine and diabolic. Divine visions are effected by representations in heaven, diabolic by magic in hell. There are also phantasmal visions, which are illusions of an estranged mind. Divine visions, produced, as we said, by representative things in heaven, are such as the prophets had, who at the time were not in the body but in the spirit. For visions cannot appear to anyone in bodily wakefulness. When these came to the prophets, therefore, it is remarked that they were in the spirit, as is plain from the following. Ezekiel said, "The Spirit picked me up and carried me to Chaldea, to the captivity in a vision of God, in the Spirit of God, so the vision rose over me, which I saw." Again, that the Spirit bore him between earth and heaven, and brought him to Jerusalem in visions of God. He was likewise in visions of God, or in the Spirit, when he saw 4 beasts which were cherubim. So too, when he saw a new temple and a new earth, and an angel measuring them. They were all Bible quotes. That he was in visions of God, then, he says, he was in the Spirit. These are, he gives like proofs from the word. Here we go. Communication with the dead would have the same result as miracles, of which just above, namely that a man would be influenced and driven into worship for a short time. But as this deprives a man of rationality, and at the same time shuts his evils in, as was said above, the captivation or the inward bond is undone, and the imprisoned evils break out with blasphemy and profanation. This last occurs, however, only when spirits induce something dogmatic from religion, which is never done by a good spirit, still less by an angel of heaven. Nevertheless, speech with spirits, rarely with angels of heaven, is possible and has been granted to many for ages. When it is granted, spirits speak with a man in his native tongue and briefly, and those who speak with the Lord's permission never say anything that takes away the freedom of the reason, nor do they instruct, for the Lord alone teaches man, doing so by means of the word to the man's enlightenment. I have been given to know this in my own experience. I have spoken with spirits and angels for many years now. No spirit has dared, and no angel has wished to tell me, still less to instruct me, about things in the Word or about any of its doctrine. The Lord alone has taught me, who revealed himself to me, and afterwards continued to appear to me, as he does now, as the Son in which he is, and as he appears to the angels, and he has enlightened me. 3. No one is reformed by threats or penalties, as these coerce. It is known that the external cannot compel the internal, but the internal can compel the external. Also that the internal refuses to be coerced by the external and turns away. It is likewise known that external enjoyments entice the assent and love of the internal, and it may also be known that there is a forced internal and a free internal. But all this, though known, needs to be lighted up. For much, on being heard, is perceived at once to be so, because it is truth, and hence is affirmed. But if it is not confirmed by reasons, it can be weakened by arguments from fallacies, and finally denied. What we have said is known, is therefore to be taken up afresh, and established rationally. First, the external cannot compel the internal, but the internal can compel the external. Who can be forced to believe or love? One can no more be compelled to believe than he can be compelled to think that something is so when he thinks it is not so, or to love than to will something that he does not will. Belief attaches to thought, and love to the will. The internal can be compelled, however, by what is external, not to speak improperly against the laws of a kingdom, the morals of life, or the sanctities of the church. The internal can be compelled to this by threats and penalties, and is compelled, and should be. But this is not the specifically human internal, but one which the human being shares with beasts. They can also be compelled. The human internal resides above this animal internal. Here the human internal, which cannot be coerced, is meant. Second, the internal refuses to be coerced by the external and turns away. The reason is that the internal wills to be in freedom and loves freedom, for as was shown, freedom attaches to man's love and life. When the internal feels it is being subjected to compulsion, therefore it withdraws as it were into itself, averts itself, and regards the compulsion as its enemy. For the love which makes man's life is irritated, and causes him to think that he is then not himself, and has no life of his own. The internal of the human being is of this nature by the law of the Lord's divine providence, that he shall act from freedom in accord with reason. Plainly then it does not harm to compel men to divine worship by threats. Plainly then it does harm to compel men to divine worship by threats and penalties. Some permit themselves to be forced to religion, some do not. Many who do are adherents of Catholicism, but this is the case with those in whom there is nothing internal in worship, but all is external. Many among those who do not allow themselves to be coerced are many of the English nation, and as a result there is what is internal in their worship, and what is external is from the internal. Their interiors in respect to religion appear in the light of the spiritual world like bright clouds, but those of the former like dark clouds. The one and the other appearance is to be seen in that world, and one who wishes may see it when he enters that world on death. Furthermore, enforced worship shuts one's evils in, which are hidden then like fire and wood under ashes, which keeps stirring and spreading until it bursts into flame. But worship, not enforced but spontaneous, does not shut evils in. These are therefore like a fire that flares up and goes out. Thence it is plain that the internal refuses to be forced by the external and turns away. The internal can compel the external because it is like a master, and the external like a servant. Third, external enjoyments entice assent and love from the internal. Enjoyments are of two kinds, of the understanding or of the will. Enjoyments of the understanding are also enjoyments of wisdom, and those of the will also enjoyments of love. For wisdom belongs to the understanding, and love to the will. Enjoyments of the body or of the senses, which are external pleasures, act as one with the internal enjoyments, which are enjoyments of the understanding and the will. Therefore, just as the internal is so averse to compulsion by the external as to turn away, it looks so kindly on enjoyment in the external that it turns to it. Assent follows on the part of the understanding, and love on the part of the will. In the spiritual world, all children are introduced by the Lord into angelic heaven, and through this into heavenly love by delightful and charming means. First by pretty things in the home and the charms of a garden, then by representations of spiritual things affecting the interiors of their minds with pleasure, and finally by truths of wisdom and goods of love. Thus they are steadily led by enjoyments in due order, first by the enjoyments of a love of the understanding and of its wisdom, and then by the enjoyments of the love of the will, which is their life's love, to which all else that has entered through enjoyment is kept subordinate. This is done because the will and understanding must all be formed by what is external before they are formed by what is internal. For they are formed first by what enters by the physical senses, chiefly the sight and the hearing. Then, when a first will and understanding have been formed, the internal of thought regards them as the externals of its thinking, and either joins itself to them or separates itself from them, as they are or are not enjoyable to it. It should be well understood, however, that the internal of the understanding does not unite itself to the internal of the will, but it is the latter that unites itself to the former and causes reciprocal union. This is done by the internal of the will, not at all by the internal of the understanding. Hence it is that man cannot be reformed by faith alone, but by the love of the will which makes a faith for itself. Fourth, there is a forced internal and a free one. A forced internal is found in those who are in external worship only, and in none that is internal. Their internal consists of thinking and willing what the external is coerced to. Such are persons who worship living or dead men or idols, or who rest their faith on miracles. No internal is possible with them which is not at the same time external. And yet a forced internal is possible with persons in internal worship. It may be forced by fear or compelled by love. That forced by fear is found in those who worship for fear of the torment and fire of hell. This internal is not the internal of thought of which we have treated, however, but an external of thought, called internal here because it partakes of thought. The internal of thought of which we have treated cannot be forced by any fear. It can be compelled by love and by fear of failing to love. In the true sense, fear of God is nothing else. To be compelled by love and by fear of failing in it is self-compulsion, and self-compulsion, it will be seen in what follows, is not contrary to freedom and rationality. It is plain then what forced worship and unforced worship are like. Forced worship is corporeal, inanimate, obscure, and sad. Corporeal because it is of the body and not of the mind, inanimate because it has no life in it, obscure for lack of understanding in it, and sad because it does not have the joy of heaven in it. But worship not forced and real is spiritual, living, seeing, and joyful. Spiritual because spirit from the Lord is in it, living because life from him is in it, seeing because wisdom from him is in it, and joyful because heaven from him is in it. 4. No one is reformed in states of no liberty or rationality. We showed above that only what a man does in freedom according to reason is made his. This is because freedom belongs to the will and reason to the understanding. Acting in freedom in accord with reason, a man acts from the will by the understanding, and what is done in the union of the two is appropriated. Now since the Lord wills that a man be reformed and regenerated in order that eternal life or the life of heaven may be his, and none can be reformed or regenerated unless good is appropriated to his will and truth to his understanding, as if they were his, and only that can be appropriated which is done in freedom of the will and in accord with the reason of the understanding. No one is reformed in states of no freedom or rationality. There are many such states, but they may be summarized as states of fear, misfortune, mental illness, physical disease, ignorance, and intellectual blindness. Something will be said of each. I might not go into those, but they were fear, misfortune, mental illness, physical disease, ignorance, intellectual blindness. Just see. Yeah, right. 5. Self-compulsion is not contrary to rationality and liberty. We have shown that man has an internal and an external of thought, that they are distinguishable as prior and subsequent, or higher and lower, and that being so distinct they can act separately and also jointly. They act separately when a man speaks and acts from the externals of his thought otherwise than he thinks and wills inwardly. They act jointly when he speaks and acts as he thinks and wills. The later is common with the sincere, the former with the insincere. Inasmuch as the internal and the external of the mind are so distinct, the internal can even fight with the external, and by combat drive it to compliance. Conflict arises when the man deems evils to be sins and resolves to desist from them. When he desists, a door is opened, and the lusts of evil which have occupied the internal of thought are cast out by the Lord, and affections of good are implanted in their place. This occurs by the internal of thought. But the enjoyments of evil lusts which occupy the external of thought cannot be cast out at the same time. Conflict arises, therefore, between the internal and the external of thought. The internal wants to cast out these enjoyments because they are enjoyments of evil and do not agree with the affections of good in which the internal now is, and wants to introduce in their place enjoyments of good which do agree. These are what are called goods of charity. From the disagreement comes the conflict which, if it grows severe, is called temptation. Now as man is man by virtue of the internal of his thought, for this is his very spirit, obviously he compels himself when he compels the external of his thought to comply or to receive the enjoyments of his affections or the goods of charity. Plainly this is not contrary to rationality and liberty, but in accord with them. Rationality starts the combat and liberty follows it up. Liberty itself resides with the rationality in the internal man, and from that in the external. Accordingly, when the internal conquers, which it does when it has reduced the external to compliance and obedience, man is given liberty itself and rationality itself by the Lord. For he is delivered by the Lord then from the infernal freedom which in itself is enslavement, is brought into heavenly freedom which is freedom in itself, and is given association with angels. The Lord himself teaches, John 8:31-36, that those who are in sins are enslaved, and that he delivers those who receive truth from him through the word. Finally, 6. The external man is to be reformed by the internal and not the other way about. By internal and external man the same is meant as by external and internal of thought, of which frequently before. The external must be reformed by the internal, because the internal flows into the external and not the reverse. The learned world knows that what is spiritual flows into what is natural and not the reverse, for reason dictates it. The Church knows that the internal must first be cleansed and made new, and the external by it then, because the Lord teaches it. He does so in the words, "Woe to you, hypocrites, for you make the outside of the cup and platter clean, but the inside is full of extortion and excess. Blind Pharisee, clean first the inside of the cup and platter, that the outside may also be made clean." We have shown in a number of places in the treatise Divine Love and Wisdom that reason dictates this. For what the Lord teaches he grants man to see rationally. This a man does in two ways. In one, he sees in himself that something is so upon hearing it. In the other, he grasps it by reasons for it. Seeing in oneself takes place in the internal man, and understanding through reasoning in the external man. Who does not perceive it within himself when he hears that the internal man is to be purified first, and the external by it? But one who does not receive the general idea of this by influx from heaven may go astray when he consults the external of his thought. From it alone no one sees but that outward works of charity and piety are saving, apart from the internal. It is so in other things, as that sight and hearing flow into thought, and smell and taste into perception, that is, that the external flows into the internal, when the contrary is true. The appearance that what is seen and heard flows into the thought is a fallacy, for the understanding does the seeing in the eye and the hearing in the ear, and not the other way about. So it is in all else. So I'll just finish reading there. I found all that Swedenborg is interesting, but this chapter was really interesting for me because I sort of made some distinctions that helped out. He talks about the Englishman and the he refers to some other people that are more easily coerced, and I think I fall more into that category. I'm easily pushed into certain things. So when I read this chapter, I realized how many things that I sort of was believing in myself that they were spiritual things that maybe I didn't really even really agree with internally, yet still accepted those things because I was told by, from that it was supposedly the spiritual idea or something like that, and then so sort of coerced into believing that these things were true, which was causing all this conflict, like all this kind of, because the internal and external was in a, they don't really agree with each other, because internally things aren't quite like, or whatever, maybe you don't even recognize that you don't agree with it because you're kind of just obeying, I suppose this is why some people are like, oh, they just don't accept authority, because this kind of thing can happen, if you accept an authority, then yeah, that's like, and people say, like trust in your own, follow your heart, or trust in your own sort of thing, which is good because it does actually protect from this kind of thing where you get told to, or whatever, like, it's just the main problem that I'm talking, like, I guess authority in general, you can talk about authority in general or freedom in general, but the main thing that I'm talking about when I'm reading from this is in terms of spiritual groups, like a church or any kind of spiritual group that you encounter these days, with potentially the best of intentions to actually find something legit, find a real spiritual path, and it's just, it can be really hard because you just encounter all these difficulties, and some things can be, it's not necessarily clear cut. It's, in a way, you're led into the right thing if you're just making a connection to the divine source, and you're kind of you've agreed that you're being led, that you're being led on this kind of journey, and you do find yourself in situations, and then of course you come through them, and then you look back and say, well, I learned something from that and was led into it. So it's just the way that things go. But like I say, this is what happened to me. that kind of got led into all these beliefs that from rationality I was like, oh, I need to reclaim my rationality back because we need rationality. This is, Swedenborg says, this is protected by the Lord, our actual own ability to be rational and to have our own, we need our own personal like sovereignty or autonomy, like and that can actually guide us better than some of these, supposed spiritual authorities or people that you would think that you might learn from, um, because it's not as simple as it might seem. I mean, like you could even tell from Swedenborg's writing that he talked about Catholicism a little bit, and that is one thing. Um, I mean, I'm all for religious tolerance and stuff, and you know, I don't really know, but um, Swedenborg wasn't. He didn't really like the Catholic interpretation of Christianity that much because he felt that that externalized it. And there are certain things which, you could obviously point out, like that even like Ken Wilber talks about, where there's like internal states, there's states of consciousness that a person goes through, but that got externalized into the form of like deacons and bishops and all this, which is like a misinterpretation because it's externalized something that's actually an internal state. Um, but there are other groups, and things do go wrong, like in spiritual groups. Sometimes you got to figure it out. Um, I mean, I'm just glad to have Swedenborg. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm going to mold my entire views to his views, but I personally feel safe. I think that's a thing that if you're finding a spiritual teacher or something like that, someone that you feel that you can trust. I mean, there's a thing because I mean, I guess in some ways you sort of, I mean, you have to be willing to learn at least. I don't know. Um, but yeah, that was sort of one of the main things. So personally, I got out of a lot of the stuff that I was involved in, and Ken Wilber, I have to say, is like really helping as well. A philosopher called Ken Wilber. If maybe I shouldn't include all that in this one video, but he makes some really good distinctions, and I think the integral thinking is really like positive. And I see that joins in with Swedenborg. Swedenborg said there was going to be a new state of consciousness, a new church that was coming upon the earth, and according to the integral movement and the studies that they're doing, that we are actually seeing a new kind of consciousness that they're calling like integral thinking or something like that, a new kind of consciousness coming into the world, and so we really are seeing changes. Um, and Swedenborg prophesies this kind of thing, and it's all that was considered the second coming of the Lord took the form of Swedenborg's books, and more broadly in the actual state of consciousness, which comes in like Christ consciousness, you could say, like coming into the earth through a new heaven. So yeah, it's really exciting times, and yeah, but you just gotta be careful. You're looking for like spiritual instruction, and I guess what Ken Wilber calls like he makes a distinction between fundamental religious views and what he calls psycho-spiritual technologies. So that's quite a good term, like, and that's what we really want to be looking for is the psycho-spiritual technologies. In other words, internal religion, not external religion. Um, and though one of the major sort of things in Integral was being able to understand like that we're not at war anymore with people who have different views or whatever. It's really just about, well, understanding, okay, this is the way that things are, and trying to get a grip on how to orientate in this situation, how the world actually is, and um, you know, so yeah, obviously, yeah, I think Swedenborg was actually ahead of his time, I reckon. I think he's probably, I don't know, but I think people are more capable of actually understanding what he was talking about these days than in the past. There was a good book, um, which I haven't read, but I know that it's called The Holographic Universe. I'm like a little bit familiar with the holographic model. So there was a book called The Holographic Universe, and that actually referenced Swedenborg quite a lot, um, showing how what he was actually talking about lined up with the holographic model. So that's even interesting from a scientific perspective, showing how we're coming through that. And yeah, Swedenborg also said that we would see changes coming through the sciences um, first, I guess. Anyway, I think I've probably talked for long enough, but thanks for listening. If you listened for all this time, I hope you got something out of it, and I'm definitely going to be making some more videos and want to um, maybe bring in some other people as well and get some conversations happening and stuff like that, and just provide more support for you who are interested in this kind of stuff, and so more support so we can connect together. And yeah, like if you like want to do a video response or something, that would be quite cool to get some actual backwards and forwards kind of stuff, and so we can join up more and kind of make use of the global connection that we have. So yeah, peace, love, wisdom. See you later.